Good morning. It's always fun to watch you guys come in, and I see faces that I see every week, and I see faces that people are back in town that I haven't seen for a long time. I wish I could watch you watching online because you're probably wearing some funny pajamas or something, but I'm glad that those of you who are watching our virtual church service are with us today as well. When I began this series, I knew that there were lots of uses of object lessons in the Bible. But researching this idea over the last month and a half or so has really been eye-opening to me. And it shouldn't be such a surprise because after all, God is the one who made us. And so he sure knows how we learn best. He used lots of object lessons in the Bible that we're never going to get to. To me, the first one feels like the snake in the garden, an object lesson. But there are so many more. In the book of 1 Peter, it explains how Noah's Ark was an early object lesson of baptism. 1 Peter 3:21 says, 8 people were saved through water in the ark, and that water symbolizes baptism, which now saves you also. We'd be hard-pressed to find a clearer object lesson example. I've stumbled upon a lot more as I've worked my way through Scripture thinking about this series. There's the tree of life, the river of life, Jesus depicted as a door and a gate through which we enter the kingdom of heaven. All those are object lessons. Jesus used a coin in a fish's mouth to teach that what we owe our government, we should pay to our government, and what we owe to God, we should give to God. Elijah used a brick and a frying pan to warn Israel, and my personal favorite was a talking jackass and a hard-headed prophet named Balaam. But we're not going to get to any of those this go-round. Object lessons are now cemented forever in the best teaching styles of educators the world over. They start very early in the nursery, and the best teachers keep using object lessons well into high school, college, and beyond. And they really help us remember what we're taught. And that's really the main purpose of an object lesson. It's the remembering part. Today is the next to last object lesson we're going to look at, but by far it's the best and most important, especially when it comes to that remembering thing. This object lesson, straight out of the pages of Scripture, has served to be, in my mind, and I think undisputably, has served to be the most effective object lesson for helping us remember something in history. Because for 2,000 years, we've been using this object lesson, and we've been remembering. For 2,000 years, we've been recreating the use of this object lesson. Everybody in here, I would bet everybody in here has seen this object lesson used. And the vast majority of us have participated in this object lesson. I would argue that it's the most recognized, most viewed, and most famous object lesson in the world because of the sheer vast number of people who have seen it. And you've probably guessed it by now, since you were maybe a little thrown for a loop when I came to preach before we observed communion today. And of course, I'm talking about the object lesson of the Lord's Supper. Now, it's hard to put ourselves in the time and the place of the Lord's Supper. So much was going on. This was the culmination of God's plan. So it's kind of hard for us 2,000 years later to put ourselves in that place. It's not an easy, casual scenario in which for us to insert ourselves. Jesus had turned the world on its ear in 3 years. Before he stepped onto the world's public stage, Israel was miserable. You have to understand that they were an occupied nation militarily defeated. The jackbooted Roman thugs would not let the Jews forget that they were the ones in control now. They kept the Jewish people under their thumb and beneath the heel of their boot. They scoffed at the Jewish God, and they tolerated his worship by the Jews as just childish, desperately clinging to a fairy tale. To the Romans, our God, the Jewish God, was impotent and insignificant, just laughable. The Jews saw it all very, very differently. They viewed the Roman defeat of their homeland as an occupation, as punishment for their own disobedience. All of the oppression and hardship they saw it as deserved for their rebellion and the rebellion of those who had come before them, their forefathers. And while the Romans saw themselves as a powerful, superior race who would remain in power forever, the Jews believed that all of this was a part of God's plan, and that God would very soon send a warrior king riding a war horse to crush the Romans and put Israel back on top. Turns out they were both wrong. So all of that was the situation before Jesus appears, seemingly out of nowhere, and begins to preach. Suddenly the Jews were inspired and the Romans were nervous and aggravated because Jesus draws huge crowds and his name becomes instantly recognizable. There is a huge shift occurring, and the Romans are increasingly concerned about it. But not all the Jews are happy about this thing. The upper crust Jews had made all kinds of shady deals with the enemy. The enemy had called in the powerful, influential Jews, and they'd said, you keep the population docile and subservient, and you can keep your position of power, influence, and authority among your own people. And those upper crust Jews had been pretty successful at that. A few rabble-rousers had tried to rouse the Romans, but these rebellions were quickly rooted out and put down with plenty of help from the collaborators. And with the coming of the Jewish Passover in Jesus' third year of ministry, it was all coming to a head. The Romans had had enough. The Jewish elite had had enough. And they began to formulate a plan to rid themselves of this rangy-looking country preacher once and for all. Now that's the setting for the Lord's Supper. And it all comes down on the first Jewish high feast day of the year. They had several. Passover. That's when it all comes down. Now, here's the short story of Passover, because if you're not familiar with the Old Testament, you'd be lost without understanding this. Here's a short story. You remember the story about God using Moses to free the Jews from captivity in Egypt. And I always joke about this, but it's reality. A whole lot of us who've never read the story have seen the Ten Commandments, with Charlton Heston on TV. And God's using Moses to free the Jews from captivity in Egypt. Now, you got to remember, this is hundreds of years before Jesus comes on the scene. When Pharaoh refuses to let the Jewish slaves go, God brings a series of oppressive plagues to bear against the Egyptians. You remember the plague of the frogs and the plague of the locusts and the plague of the river, the water turning to blood. But the final plague is the one that broke the will and broke the collective back of Egypt. God sent an angel of death throughout the entire country of Egypt to kill the firstborn in every family. But the Jews were told that if they followed God's instructions, that the death angel, you're going to love this, would pass over them. That's why it's called the Feast of the Passover. God said, if you'll do what I tell you, the angel of death will pass over your home and spare your lives. And there were several things that they had to do. They were to choose a perfect lamb to sacrifice to God. And the blood from that lamb was to be painted over the doorpost of the Jewish homes. The avenging angel would see the blood and know that a sacrifice had been made to God, and the angel of death would pass over that house. And that very night, a special kind of solemn religious meal should be prepared and eaten. Moses says something like this: brothers and sisters, God has revealed to me that we are going to be set free after 400 years. We're going to be set free in a matter of hours. Prepare a meal of unleavened bread. Now, this is a very significant detail. See, it takes time for leaven to make bread rise. It doesn't just happen instantly. It takes time for bread to rise. And Moses was saying, you Jews, you don't have time for that. You don't have time to wait for the bread to rise. At any moment, Pharaoh is going to release us. Now, that seemed immediately unbelievable all by itself. But Moses says, you got to be ready to move immediately when the word is given. So don't take the time that's necessary for bread to rise. Just bake unleavened bread, which will be ready quickly, and eat it right now so you'll have strength for the journey. But Moses wasn't done. He said, eat the Passover meal ready to travel. Put your shoes on. You're not going to have time to lace up your shoes when God says go. So already have them on and be ready. Have your robe lifted and tucked into your belt, prepared to move fast. Now, a little explanation is due here. It would have been traditional in a Jewish home to remove your shoes when you came inside. Part of it was a cleanliness thing. You know, you had the dust of the dirt roads of Palestine all over your shoes. You're liable to have stepped in some animal waste on the way to visit wherever you were going. Usually somebody inside the home would have a basin of water ready so that when you removed your shoes at the door, they'd wash the dirt off your feet. Also, when you were walking or working outside, you would take the long robe that was traditional, that went down to your feet, and it was all the way down to your feet, and you'd probably grab it like right about here. Then you pull it up and tuck it into your robe here. So now the robe is probably up around your knees. You did that so your feet wouldn't get tangled while you're walking along these streets or chasing sheep or plowing or doing whatever you're doing. But you tuck your robe up into this belt. When you came inside of a home to relax, you would pull that out of your belt and let your robe down. It was more comfortable like that, and it was probably also more modest when you're sitting around the house. But Moses is saying, keep your shoes on. Don't take them off at the door. Keep your shoes on. Leave them laced up tight. And leave your robe tucked into your belt, ready to run. Because when God says go, brother, you got to go. One last detail, Moses says, and don't put your walking stick down. Keep it in your hand. Keep the stick in one hand and eat with the other hand. Again, be ready to split. You haven't got time to go looking for your walking stick. When God says move, you go. So, all the symbolism, every year afterward, after the feast has been established, this is how the Jews would celebrate it. It, in itself, was another object lesson. We're really kind of learning about two object lessons today. Because the whole idea of eating unleavened bread and the whole Passover idea, that was an object lesson reminding the Jews how quickly God would act. And this is significant because the Passover reminded people that when God makes a promise, he's going to fulfill it. And it's not going to take long. And when the time comes, when God fulfills his promise to you, you better be ready to move. So it took a while for us to get to this place in the sermon, but here we are. Jesus and his disciples have come to a home to observe the Passover. That's what good Jews do. It's Passover time. They're going to observe the Passover feast. The Romans had planned for this. They knew a good Jew like Jesus would not skip something as important as the Passover feast. And they were ready to jump him, and then they got an unexpected turn of fortune. Matthew 26, 14 through 17. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. And from then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. The disciples, unaware of Judas's deal, of course, make the proper preparations to celebrate the Passover meal as they've been doing their whole life, once a year for their whole life. I mean, it's almost like Christmas. You know how to prepare for it. You know how you're going to spend that day. You've done it once a year for your whole life. So they make the proper preparations to celebrate the Passover meal. They assemble, ready to do what they've done every year for their whole lives. So they're all there. Jesus and his disciples. Matthew 26, 20 through 25. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad, and they began to say to him, one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." And Jesus answered, "You have said so." Now on your way in, we gave you a little notepad, just a little brown notepad. And I hope you grabbed a pen or a pencil. If you didn't take time to do that, try to grab a pen or a pencil now. I want you to take that little notepad out, if you would, and open it to the first page. And at the top of that little pad, on that first page at the top, would you just write the word Passover? Now, under that word Passover, I just want you to jot a few notes and lines as to what you know about Passover, whether you just learned it or whether you knew it all along. What was it about? What was Passover about? What did it memorialize? Just write a few lines. Just if you only know one or two things, just write one or two things. But I want you to write a little bit about what you know about it. Now we're almost there to where we can put ourselves into this scene. We can insert ourselves into this scene. The disciples thought they knew what to expect. I mean, they had observed this sacred Jewish tradition so many times. Again, like Christmas, they could do it with their eyes closed. They knew how it went. They knew what to do. They knew what was happening. They've done this before many times. And in addition to that, I kind of think that they expected that this was when everything was going to get real. I just think maybe they had an inkling. This is what it's come down to. It's about to get real. They had made it clear that for the most part, they believed that Jesus Christ was the long-awaited Messiah. And they also knew that the Romans had gotten deadly serious, and they were probably going to make their move to kill Jesus at any moment. So I think that the disciples think that this is when everything's about to get real. They believed Jesus was the Messiah. They knew the Romans had gotten deadly serious. They're probably going to make their move to kill Jesus at any moment. We need to be ready. I wonder if any of the disciples thought that they were witnessing, right then, Wonder if they thought that they were witnessing the last dying moments of the Roman government. I wonder if they thought, this is it. Roman government is about to go up in flames. We're going to see the end. That Jesus was going to eat the Passover meal, and then just like Moses was rushing the Jews to get out of Egypt, did they think Jesus was going to say something like, now get up! This very night, God will free you from the Romans like he freed your forefathers from the Egyptians centuries ago. We have no time to tarry, no time to waste. Let us leave this place and join the army of angels that's been sent by my Father. Tonight, we are going to crush the Romans, and we're going to reestablish the strength and power to Israel, and I will rule Palestine forever as the promised Messiah. And maybe that's a bit much to kind of assume on my part, but it sure would make sense. That's what they've been waiting for hundreds of years. Their anticipation and their expectation was real. They'd watched Jesus closely for 3 years. They were convinced he was the Messiah, and they were ready to roll. They were ready to roll. But there was so much they didn't know. Most of all, they didn't know that it wasn't going to go like that at all. They didn't know that Jesus came to save their souls, not their nation. They didn't know that he wasn't going to do it with shock and awe, but with sacrifice. They weren't going to be saved by a destroyer. They were going to be saved by a lamb. They didn't know that Jesus was going to be brutally beaten, tortured beyond imagination, and that they were going to abandon him and make him endure it alone. Had anybody told them the Romans were about to nail Jesus to a cross, they would have scoffed and they would have said, Jesus is a man of miracles. Iron nails can never hold him to a cross. But the last thing they didn't know was that it wouldn't be nails. It would be love that held him pinned to the cross. His love for them and his love for us. In your notepad, go to another page. Clean page, and just write at the top of that page, the sufferings of Jesus. The sufferings of Jesus. Just write that on the second page. Write some words about what Jesus went through, both before and during the crucifixion. Just a word or two is fine. But try to think about everything you know about what Jesus went through. And just list what you know. Don't worry about what you don't know. That's not important. Just write down what you do know. Okay, so this is what we know. The Roman government has been waiting for this moment. They have a volunteer traitor in Judas. They are itching to get rid of this thorn in their side for good. On the other side, Jesus' disciples are locked and loaded. They have been anticipating and expecting this moment for months. Let them start their war. Let them come for our guy. God is on our side. Go ahead and bring it and see what happens. They've prepared for this Passover feast. This is going to be a special one, maybe the most special one since Moses celebrated it in Egypt. They are ready to get to it. They sit down, and boy, does Jesus throw a wrench into the works. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." They must have looked at each other on either side. I'm absolutely sure that at least a few of those disciples cast odd glances at each other. They've been to dozens of Passover feasts, and nobody's ever said anything like that before they ate. What's going on with Jesus? Has he forgotten the ritual of the Passover? Was he so stressed and overtired that he was going off the rails a little? But my friends, this was the object lesson. We've talked about all of this just to get here. This was the object lesson. And what did we say about object lessons? That they're mainly for the remembering. And though they didn't realize it at the time, this was going to be the object lesson that would never be forgotten. Paul laid it out for all of us in 1 Corinthians 11. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." I don't think the apostles saw it sitting around the table. I don't think they saw it, but I see it now. Now I get it. They'd been so hard-headed. They thought Jesus was a political powerhouse who'd come to crush the Romans and make Israel the most important nation again. But Jesus was about to die on a cross. And when he did, it was going to throw everything into confusion. It was not going to make any sense that our Messiah is about to die on a cross. Jesus needed them to get this because, it was the center of everything. I'm about to sacrifice my own self, my very body in your place. I'm not fighting for you and conquering for you. I'm dying for you. I'm paying the price for all your failures, all your deep regrets, and all the things you wish you could do over. Can I say that again for us? That Jesus was dying for all our failures and all our deep regrets and all the things you and I wish we could do over. And Jesus is saying, I need you to remember that because some things are going to happen that you're not going to understand. So here, take this bread. You didn't break it, I broke it. The Romans didn't break it, I broke it. Willingly, I broke it for you because I love you. This bread here represents my body. It's about to be broken for you. Take your notepad and on a clean page, the third clean page, I want you to write two words, for me, for me. Now this one's going to be a lot tougher, because I want you to write some words under for me to represent why Jesus suffered for you. In other words, what was Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, forgiving you for? What are your things that Jesus had to die to pay the price for? Now, be as specific as you can, but you can write it in code if you want, something only you understand. And by the way, I'll never ask you to show this to anybody. Now, you're not turning these books in or anything like that. This is for you. And I realize this is very personal, but be as specific as you can. What in your life was Jesus dying to pay for? The New Testament book of Acts tells us that when the earliest disciples met, it was on the first day of the week. It was on Sunday. And when they met, they observed this object lesson afresh. And we've been doing it every Sunday ever since then. An unbroken line stretching back to a dusty Palestinian room where Jesus himself sat down to eat. And I hope that it might be a little clearer in your minds now. Look at that last page you just wrote. Look at what you wrote under for me. Go back and read over what you wrote under for me. And take a moment and talk to God about it. This is the object lesson that's never been forgotten. Now, I've asked some bakers in our congregation to create unleavened Passover bread as authentic as we can make it. It's about to be passed to you. When it reaches you, I want you to tear off a piece of that bread, and I want you to imagine Jesus saying to you, "Take and eat. This is my body." And when you're ready, do that. Serve me, Ron. Thank you. That same time, he did the same thing with the Passover wine. But this time he said, In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and whenever you drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." It's for remembering. That's why there are object lessons, so we'll remember. So in a moment, when you drink, remember. As the cups are making their way towards you, glance back at that last page in your little notebook if you want to. There's just one more thing I want you to consider before we're done here today. I'm never the smartest guy in the room, but I noticed that a lot about the Passover feast had to do with immediacy, getting ready right now and staying ready. And I doubt that's accidental, though we don't equate the Lord's Supper with urgency or immediacy very often. Think about what they were told in the Passover. Don't wait for your bread to rise. You don't have time for that. Eat the flat bread, unleavened. Keep your shoes on. Keep them laced up, ready to go while you eat. Tuck your robe up away from your feet and be ready to run. Keep your walking stick in your hand, because when the Lord says go, you won't have time to look for it. I think it's worth us considering that the time to get ready isn't later, it's now. I would urge you to stop procrastinating if you've got a decision to make. Make your decision now. Decide that when God shows you a need among neighbors, you're going to try to help. That when God puts you in contact with someone who's lost, you're going to do something. End of this week, I got a phone call late one afternoon from a man who said, my friend wants to be baptized and he's asked me to do it. I told him we can do it right now. Can we do it right now? I said, you bet. I'm waiting for you. And within about 15 minutes, those two men were in the baptistry, because they both understood the urgency and the immediacy of answering God's call. Now, if you've never made that decision, think about Passover. Think about what you know about it. That there was a sense of urgency and immediacy. Now, what we're going to do is what we always do at the end of a sermon. There's going to be someone waiting right over here from our Faith Walk team, and they're going to be ready to help you make that decision. And Jim Ward, our associate minister, is going to be ready to baptize you. Think about that when God says go, you're going to do something. That when God says it's time, let's go right now, that you're going to be standing at the door with your walking stick in your hand and your running shoes laced up tight on your feet and a last bite of unleavened bread still in your mouth, and anything that might slow you down or trip you up, you've taken care of that. Urgency, immediacy, feel it and act on it. Through this toilsome world at last, once and only once I pass. If a kindness I may show, if a good deed I may do, let me do it while I can. No delay, for it is plain I shall not pass this way again. No delay.